This is the second part of building the features section. So this is where we left off after the last lecture, and so now it's time to actually style these icons, this heading and the paragraph, and after we're done doing that, we will then lay them out here in this way. So the icon here on this side, and then these two, one after the other. Okay, but let's start by styling these three. So we have the icon and the text and then the heading separately. So we have features and then we have the feature. So this feature component here would in theory be reusable in another page. So it's completely independent from the features class. But I still put them in the same file though, because they are closely related. And having these classes in different files would make me jump around a lot through the different files. And that would be terrible for recording videos like this. Okay, and so basically each of the section now got its own file. And then there I have the overall element, which is like the container of these components. But again, these feature here would be completely reusable somewhere else later on the page, or if I had another page on my website. Okay, so let's style the icon. And then let's also style the text. Okay, and actually let's start with the text. Let's set the font size to 1.7 rem. And that's it. So actually we don't have to do anything else, just increasing the font size here a bit. Then as for the icon, let's change the color. And remember how we do that with SVG icons. So what we have to do is to use the fill property. And then we use the primary color. So color primary. And so that's our golden color here again. And then finally, let's just size it. So we want a width of 45 pixels, so 4.5 rem. And then the same for the height. So that's usually the same. Okay. And now finally, we also want to style the heading 4. And that's going to be in the typography file. And so heading 4. And we will then also later have the heading 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let me actually do all of them here. Why not? So 1, 2, 3, and then 4 here. All right. So we want them to have the font family that I mentioned before, which is this one here. Oh, sorry. Now I close it. So we want the font display. So it's Josephine Sans. And that's the one that we're going to use for all of the headings. So it is font display. And we also want the font weight to be 400. And remember, we actually included that font weight in the HTML from Google Fonts. Okay. Now we actually want all of these to have these two properties. And so that's a perfect use case for a Sass extend, right? So we can do like this placeholder that I showed you a long time ago, I think. We haven't really used it since then, but now it's a good time to use it again. So we use this placeholder, which I'm simply going to call heading. Then I put this here. And now all I have to do is to extend all of these like this. So I say extend and heading. And that's it. And so what's going to happen now is that basically this heading 1 here is copied like to this place here. So let's copy this all over the place here. And so what's going to happen now, it's like as if this heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, and heading 4 will be copied here to this selector. All right. So it's not a mixin because the mixin works the other way around. So with the mixin, this code here would then be pasted into each of the selectors. And with an extend, it works the other way around. So basically these selectors are copied into a huge selector, which then makes this code here apply to all of them, right? So anyway, we were talking about the heading 4, and here the font size, we want it to be 1.9 rem. Now remember that I told you that we want to use this heading 4 in different situations throughout the page. Okay, so we want to use it here on these features, but also this one here is an H4 as well. And you see that this one is white and this one is dark. And so let's actually do that with a modifier class. Okay, so let's add a modifier class, one for light, and the color here is going to be gray light 1. Okay, and then we will have dark, and that's going to be gray dark 1. And actually it's here. And so, all right, let's just duplicate this. And so this one is for dark. Now we of course have to add this here to the HTML as well. And so let's add multiple cursors here in each of them, so we don't have to write it once. So heading 4, and this one is the dark version. Okay, so the modifier is with these 2 dashes. All right, and I think that's actually it. So let's check it out in our page. And that already looks quite good, right? So this icon here has the correct size, and all of this looks just like we have it here. Okay, now all we have to do is to actually align these elements like we have it here. And how are we going to do that? Well, once again, we are going to use CSS Grid here, because why not? This is just a small component, and we actually have a 2-dimensional layout here, right? So let's take a look. So this is actually 2-dimensional. So we have the row axis and the column axis. And so it's really 2-dimensional. And so why not use a CSS grid for doing that? So we will have a 2x2 grid. And let me show it to you here actually already. And that's not the one, but that's the one. So we're going to have this 2x2 grid. And then in there, we will place these 3 elements. Okay, does that make sense? So typography is done for now. And so this feature here, which itself is a grid item, of course, will now also become a grid container. And so we have a grid inside a grid inside a grid. So just like we had in Flexbox, we can really nest the grids really deep. So display grid. And let's start by defining the columns. Grid template columns. And so what width do we want to have for the first column? So the first column will contain the icon. And we already know the width of the icon, so it's 4.5 rem. And so in this column here, we could simply put 4.5 rem as well, right? But instead of doing that, we will simply put auto. Okay, or we could use min content or max content. So let's actually use min content. Why not? Because this way, if we eventually wanted to change the width here of the icon, then automatically the width of this first column would adjust without us having to change anything. And then the rest of the grid, so the second column, will simply occupy the rest. Okay, simple as that. Okay, makes sense? And now as for the rows, again, we don't really need to specify them, because all we want to happen is them to be the size of the content. And so once more, we don't really define them. And probably you start to see this emerging like as a trend. So many times we don't really define the rows, we just define the columns. And in a real world scenario, that's actually many times the case. So many times we just want the content to define the rows. And so in that case, it's not really necessary to define the rows. We will have other cases where we will define the rows, and you're going to see that later. But for now, it's good like this. It works perfectly fine like this. So let's check it out. And we'll see that it's actually not really perfect yet. Okay, so let's check out what's happening here. And so let's inspect this. And so here you see our 4 grid cells. So the first one is actually larger, much larger than the icon. And that's because right now we only have 3 elements in this grid. And so the third one, of course, because of the auto placement algorithm, gets placed here under this icon. So what we could do here is to place this grid item here in this grid cell. But actually what's even better is to make this grid cell here span all the way here until the end, so that we end up with this grid area here for this icon. Because right now this row here is also as high as this icon, but actually we just want it to be as large, as high as this text here. And so if we had all of this column here, so these 2 rows for this icon, then that would actually happen perfectly fine. So let me show that to you. So the icon, we wanted to have the grid row property set to start at number 1 all the way to the end, or span 2. So in this case, it's really the same. We could just add -1, and then we're sure that it goes all the way until the end. And so automatically now the text should get placed here to the end. And for some reason that didn't really happen. And so this is actually a good opportunity to tell you something important that I didn't tell you yet, I think. So this -1 here, this means not the end of the grid, but the end of the explicit grid. Okay, and so this would be the last explicit grid line, but we didn't really define any grid rows, right? And so there's not really an explicit grid. And so this -1 here doesn't make much sense. So instead of this -1, we should simply add span 2. Okay, makes sense? So again, the -1 only works with an explicit grid, but we had an implicit grid because we didn't define the rows. And so it didn't work as expected. Right now it does. Okay, and so let's inspect it here as well. So it doesn't really highlight here the spanning going on, but that doesn't matter because we can see it by ourselves, because you see that this icon here is actually already in this second cell. And so this is like all the same cell. Actually, I think if you hover it here, then you will see it. Well, not really, but again, that's not a huge problem. So we're almost done here now. What we need now is, of course, some spacing here. So add some space between the columns and the rows. And that's very simple, of course. So just add a grid row gap, and let's make it 1.5 rem, and then a gap for the column as well. So grid column gap. And this one is 2.5 rem. Okay, so let's check it out again. And all right, here we go. That looks really good already. Just a couple of things that we need to change here. So first of all, in our demo project, these icons here are actually a bit moved to the top. So basically to center the center of the icon here with the text. And that's just something that we have to do manually, okay? And so let's fix that. So we're very simply just gonna translate the icon a bit to the top. So transform and translate in the Y direction just -1 rem. Okay, and so that should fix that. Yeah, so that looks a bit more natural now. And now the second issue is that you see in these two columns where we only have 3 lines of text, that the space here is huge. Okay, so I mentioned before that I wanted to have different text in the different elements, and that's because I wanted to show you how we can fix exactly this issue. So let's actually inspect it. So we want this one here now. And so you can see that this row here is larger than the row in here and in here, right? And so why is this happening? Well, it's happening because this features grid here, which contains these 6 grid items, makes it so that these grid items, that all of the grid items fill the entire grid cells, right? And so that's because of the align items property that is by default set to stretch. Remember that? So align items is the property that controls the alignment of grid items along grid cells. And so these here are the grid items of this features grid. And currently this align items property is set to stretch. So what do we do if we want all of them here to start at the top? So basically move all of this here to the top. Well, we just have to set the align items property on this parent container here to start. So let's do that. And so this here is the grid container. And so align items, let's set it to start. Okay, and if we're back now, that is how it looks like. So we could maybe even give this here like a background color, but actually that's not even necessary. Because even with this inspector here, you can see that this grid item is now no longer the exact same of the grid cell, but just the size of its content moved all the way to the top, just as we specify at the grid container. Of course, we could also set this like to end. So let me show you how that would look like. And yeah, so then it would move these two here, which are smaller than the other items. It would move them simply to the end, so to the bottom of their grid cell. Or we could try center also. All right, and so now it's centered, but that's still not what we want. We just want them to be at the start. Okay, and so it's really important that you are aware that all of these properties that I showed you in the first section, so in the intro section, that all of these properties exist and what they do and how you can use them to your advantage to achieve exactly what you need to achieve. Okay, and so in this case, we really needed the align items to move all of this up to the top, so up the column axis. All right, and so right now it actually looks the exact same as our demo. There's just one small thing to fix, because when you reduce this here, what you see is that it gets narrower and narrower and even more narrow. So what we want to do here, of course, is what I showed you in the last section, which is basically to make this responsive without writing a single line of media query. Okay, and so that's what happens here. So as you see, at some point, well, the text gets smaller, and that's because of media query, but that's not what I'm talking about. So what happens is that at some point, you see that it moves down here. And so instead of a 3x2 grid, we now have a 2x3. Okay, and then as it gets even smaller, it does basically a 1x6 grid. Okay, and so that's what we want to achieve, and that's quite simple actually, and even without media queries. So do you remember how we did that? Well, all we have to change here is this grid template columns and define some new column tracks. So grid template columns. So do you remember what the trick here is? Well, first of all, we need to use the autofit keyword in here. And remember what autofit does? It simply creates as many tracks as can fit based on the width that we define. Okay, and so this width that we define here will be with a min-max function. So min-max, and we say that the width should always stay between 25 rem and 1 fractional unit. And that's as simple as it. And actually I said 25. Okay, so 250 pixels basically. So again, the width of each of the tracks should always stay between 250 rem and 1 fractional unit. And based on this, CSS will add as many tracks as fit in the container. Okay, so that's exactly what we did in one of the demo examples in the last section. So let's check it out if it works. So where is the container? Okay, so we start with the 1120 pixels, and so let's move it down now. And remember that each column can have up to 250 pixels. So we start decreasing, and then bam, you see at this point it no longer could fit 3 columns, and so it reduced it to 2 columns. Okay, so let's check it out here. So you see this feature here as 251, which is almost the minimum size that it has to have. So you see it now, bam. So 250, and a bit less will push it off the edge and bring it down to 2 column tracks. Okay, so that's really amazing. That's really great and powerful. And now you see that it's even more important to use this align items set to start that I had before. For example, now here you have a lot of empty space down here, and so it's really important that you see that if we inspect this here, so the size of the item is just this, and so without the align items set to start, it would look really weird. Okay, so this works just the way I explained before, and everything is working. Of course, we could change this 250 pixels to something else, but I found that it works really well in this particular situation. Okay, and so we're actually done with this section. So we used 2 grids here, so one big grid which could fit all of these 6 items here. So one grid item for each feature, and then each feature is a grid container itself, which then itself contains these 3 grid items. So the icon, this H4, and this text. And grid allows us to nest as many grids inside of each other, and that is very helpful to create even very small 2-dimensional layouts like this one. So we could have used like Flexbox for this one here as well, But then we would have to mess like with margins. We would have added a margin to the bottom of this here, for example, or the top of the text. And that would have added some extra complexity that is not really necessary if we can use CSS Grid. Okay, so grids don't only work for the big layout parts like some people say, but they can also be for very small components as long as they are two-dimensional. Then it makes a lot of sense using grids for that. Okay, so next up, we're going to build this part here. Okay, so yeah, stay tuned for that.